Good evening, everyone. Good evening. Hi. My name is Stephanie Lei. I'm the Director of Illuminations. Thank you. UCI Chancellor's Art and Culture Initiative. Today I have my greatest pleasure and honor to host Ada Limón, our newest and 24th Poet Laureate of the United States. Yes. She's also the first Latina poet who got this award. Yes. So Ada Limón has 6 poetry collections, including The Hurting Kind, which is the newest publication published in 2020, and The Caring. So both books are available there after the talk and the poetry reading and the conversation. So I'm expecting a very enchanted evening with her, with lovely poetry. So other than writing and teaching, and Ada Limón is also hosts a podcast called Slowdown, The Slowdown. I don't know if you have heard about that, but it's like a 5-minute daily poetry boost. So it's very exciting. It's how you could like slow down and take time to listen to a poem being read by her. So without further ado, let's welcome Ada Limón. Thank you.
Hello. How are you? Oh, hey, you look great. It's so good to see you. It's so wonderful to be here in California, my home state. And you know it's my home state because I have 2 cousins here. Yeah, hi. So it's such a pleasure and honor. Thank you, Daphne, for hosting me. I thought what I would do is sort of do a reading, but also kind of tell you a little background story of each poem and kind of give you some, some insight into how the poem was made and things like that. So we can chat a little bit about that, and then we'll have a little Q&A afterwards. Does that sound good? Yeah. And look, you made it out in the rain. See, Californians don't melt in the rain. We can do it. We need the rain. It would be nice if it didn't come all at once. This is a poem that is one of the opening poems in my book, The Carrying. And I wrote it, I wanted to read it because it's January, and I had been asked in 2016 to write the first poem that would appear on the Poem a Day website, the poets.org website for the Academy of American Poets. They said, can you write a poem that will be will sort of set the tone for the whole year? And I remember thinking, no, I have no idea how to do that. And it was also at a time where it feels not unlike now, where we are sort of careening from one crisis to the next. And so I was trying to have some hope, and yet I also felt like things were very difficult, which is not unlike how I feel now. And so I thought I would read it just to give you an example of what maybe a prompt can do, and how you can think of trying to do that for yourself at some point, writing a poem that might sort of exemplify a year or a time. The Leash. After the birthing of bombs, of forks and fear, the frantic automatic weapons unleashed, the spray of bullets into a crowd holding hands, that brute sky opening in a slate metal maw that swallows only the unsayable in each of us, what's left? Even the hidden nowhere river is poisoned orange and acidic by a coal mine. How can you not fear humanity? Want to lick the creek bottom dry, to suck the deadly water up into your own lungs like venom? Reader, I want to say, don't die. Even when silvery fish after fish comes back belly up and the country plummets into a crepitating crater of hatred, isn't there still something singing? The truth is, I don't know. But sometimes I swear I hear it, the wound closing like a rusted-over garage door, and I can still move my living limbs into the world without too much pain, can still marvel at how the dog runs straight toward the pickup trucks, breaknecking down the road because she thinks she loves them, because she's sure without a doubt that the loud, roaring thing will love her back. Her soft, small self alive with desire to share her goddamn enthusiasm. Until I yank the leash back to save her, because I want her to survive forever. Don't die, I say. And we decide to walk for a bit longer. Starlings high and fevered above us, winter coming to lay her cold corpse upon this little plot of earth. Perhaps we are always hurtling our bodies toward the thing that will obliterate us, begging for love from the speeding passage of time. And so maybe, like the dog obedient at my heels, we can walk together peacefully, at least until the next truck comes. Thank you. There was, I had written sort of a few, because I think when someone gives you a prompt like that, it's hard not to, write a few examples or write a few different things, and in case one fails, there might be something else in another one. And then they had accepted it, and then from there, I was putting together the carrying, and I thought, that's going to be the opening poem for the book. And my editor said, no. They said, they love it, but just move it 3 poems back. You just want to ease them in a little bit more. I was like, okay. They're like, I guess they didn't want to start. I said, but it says don't die. It's hopeful. But this is one of the poems that actually precedes it. And when people ask you sometimes, and especially in the public position that the laureateship is, they'll ask you about, where you're from and who are your people and all of these things. And sometimes I want to say, I'm from trees. And so this is that poem. Ancestors, I've come here from the rocks, the bone-like chert, obsidian, lava rock. I've come here from the trees, chestnut, bay laurel, toyon, acacia, redwood, cedar, 1,000 oaks that bend with moss and old man's beard. I was born on a green couch on Carriger Road between the vineyards and the horse pasture. I don't remember what I first saw, the brick of light that unhinged me from the beginning. I don't remember my brother's face, my mother, my father. But later, I remember leaves, through car windows, through bedroom windows, through the classroom window, the way they shaded and patterned the ground, all that power from roots. Imagine you must survive without running. I've come from the lacing patterns of leaves. I do not know where else I belong. Thank you. And maybe if someone says, no, but really, where are you from? You can say, trees, rocks, the ocean. This is a poem that is for my mother, and I was born, it's not unusual, maybe many of you have it, I have scoliosis, which is a curvature in the spine, and for a long time, my doctor really wanted for me to have surgery and a brace, and my mother and my father decided to kind of see if they could avoid that so that I wasn't in a brace for a whole year, which is what they wanted to do. And I think I was just 8 at the time. And this poem is a poem that came to me almost completed while I was driving. And it started with the end, and then I built backwards. And so I'm going to read it to you. This is a poem for my mother. The Raincoat. When the doctor suggested surgery and a brace for all my youngest years, my parents scrambled to take me to massage therapy, deep tissue work, osteopathy, and soon my crooked spine unspooled a bit. I could breathe again and move more in a body unclouded by pain. My mom would tell me to sing songs to her the whole 45-minute drive to Middle 2 Rock Road and 45 minutes back from physical therapy. She'd say that even my voice sounded unfettered by my spine afterward. So I sang and sang because I thought she liked it. I never asked her what she gave up to drive me or how her day was before this chore. Today, at her age then, I was driving myself home from yet another spine appointment, singing along to some maudlin but solid song on the radio. And I saw a mom take her raincoat off and give it to her young daughter when a storm took over the afternoon. My God, I thought, my whole life I've been under her raincoat, thinking it's somehow a marvel that I never got wet. Thank you. So that poem, that image was something that happened to me, and then, I built backwards from there because it was something where I felt like, that image was so clear to me, and it felt like it was teaching me something, and then I had to build the poem backwards, which rarely happens. Most of the time, you work toward an ending, not away from it. And this is a poem for the planet, I think. But the way this poem started is with the sound. Do you know when everybody rolls out their trash bins all at once, or like that same night, and you kind of think it's thunder for a second, and then you're like, oh no. And so I was trying to think about that, and I kept thinking, I was like, oh, it's the suburban thunder that we hear. And that's how the poem began in my mind, and of course, then it became something else. Dead stars. Out here, there's a bowing even the trees are doing. Winter's icy hand at the back of all of us, black bark, slick yellow leaves, a kind of stillness that feels so mute it's almost in another year. I am a hearth of spiders these days, a nest of trying. We point out the stars that make Orion as we take out the trash, the rolling containers, a song of suburban thunder. It's almost romantic as we adjust the waxy blue recycling bin until you say, man, we should really learn some new constellations. And it's true. We keep forgetting about Antlia, Centaurus, Draco, Lacerta, Hydra, Lyra, and Lynx. But mostly we're forgetting we're dead stars too. My mouth is full of dust and I wish to reclaim the rising, to lean in the spotlight of streetlight with you toward what's larger within us, toward how we were born. Look, we are not unspectacular things. We've come this far, survived this much. What would happen if we decided to survive more, to love harder? What if we stood up with our synapses and flesh and said no? No to the rising tides, stood for the many mute mouths of the sea, the land. What would happen if we used our bodies to bargain for the safety of others, for Earth, if we declared a clean night, if we stopped being terrified, if we launched our demands into the sky, made ourselves so big people could point to us with the arrows they make in their minds, rolling their trash bins out after all of this is over? Thank you. How are you doing? You're good? Okay, and you can hear me okay and everything? Okay, I forgot to ask that. This is a poem that also deals with the repercussions of a body that's not always the easiest body to be in, but I'm very grateful body. And yeah, what else to say about it? Except I also have always loved Wonder Woman. And I loved the comic book, and I loved the show. I loved it when I found out that Linda Carter was Mexican. So, Wonder Woman. Standing at the swell of the muddy Mississippi after the urgent care doctor had just said, well, sometimes shit happens. I fell fast and hard for New Orleans all over again. Pain pills swirled in the purse along with a spell for later. It's taken a while for me to admit I am in a raging battle with my body. A spinal column 35 degrees bent, vertigo that comes and goes like a DC Comics villain nobody can kill. Invisible pain is both a blessing and a curse. You always look so happy, said a stranger once, as I shifted to my good side, grinning. But that day, alone on the riverbank, brass blaring from the steamboat Natchez, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a girl, maybe half my age, dressed for no apparent reason as a Wonder Woman. She strutted by in all her strength and glory, invincible, eternal, and when I stood to clap, because who wouldn't have, she bowed and posed like she knew I needed a myth, a woman by a river, indestructible. That's a true story. It was very sweet. I have a wonderful friend who sent me a picture of a 10-year-old in a Wonder Woman costume, and she said, I always think of you when I see this picture. And I was like, I love that. And I was like, but I wasn't 20, but I love that half my age. She said, it's half your age, and I was like, she's 10. But I love that you think of me as 20, and we'll just start with that. We'll keep that. This is a poem I wrote that, it's one of those poems that, for me, talks about the difference between representation and tokenism. And I think it's a poem, it's important to me for many reasons, but I also think that it's working on many levels in terms of its multiplicity. So it can seem a little straightforward, but I think, hopefully it will do different things to different people. I'll say that. This poem is called "The Contract Says We'd Like the Conversation to Be Bilingual." When you come, bring your brownness so we can be sure to please the funders. Will you check this box? We're applying for a grant. Do you have any poems that speak to troubled teens? Bilingual is best. Would you like to come to dinner with the patrons and sip Patron? Will you tell us the stories that make us uncomfortable, but not complicit? Don't read us the one where you were just like us, born to a greenhouse garden. Don't tell us how you picked tomatoes and ate them in the dirt, watching vultures pick apart another bird's bones in the road. Tell us the one about your father stealing hubcaps after a colleague said that's what his kind did. Tell us how he came to the meeting wearing a poncho and tried to sell the man his hubcaps back. Don't mention your father was a teacher, spoke English, loved making beer, loved baseball. Tell us again about the poncho, the hubcaps, how he stole them, how he did the thing he was trying to prove he didn't do. Thank you. That poem is based on two true stories. One of them is that invitation where they asked for the conversation to be bilingual, and the other one is that my father was a teacher for a very long time and a school administrator, and when he went to a school administrators meeting in a certain part of town, one of the other administrators said he didn't want to park his car there because the Mexicans there would steal his hubcaps. My father, being Mexican, went out and stole the man's hubcaps. And then came to the meeting almost a month later wearing a poncho and a sombrero and tried to sell, were like, do you want to buy these hubcaps? And when my father retired from that particular school district, they gave him an engraved hubcap. So, yeah. I get to see him tomorrow. I'm very excited. This is a poem that I'm going to read, and I'll say that when I wrote it, I just found something in my, oh good. Sometimes I find these things in my books and I'm like, oh, I should have called that person. Like right in the middle of something, like, oh, this was an urgent email, But it wasn't, it was okay. My heart's like, oh no, what was that? This is a poem that after I wrote it, I thought, well, I guess I'll never be the poet laureate now. So I'm going to read this poem, and you can see that I was like, are you sure? A new national anthem. The truth is, I've never cared for the national anthem. If you think about it, it's not a good song. It's too high for most of us, with the rocket's red glare. And then there are the bombs. Always, always, there is war and bombs. Once I sang it at homecoming and threw even the tenacious high school band off key. But the song didn't mean anything, just a call to the field, something to get through before the pummeling of youth. And what of the stanzas we never sing? The third that mentions no refuge could save the hireling and the slave. Perhaps the truth is, every song of this country has an unsung third stanza. Something brutal snaking underneath us as we absent-mindedly sing the high notes with a beer sloshing in the stands, hoping our team wins. Don't get me wrong. I do like the flag, how it undulates in the wind like water, elemental, and best when it's humbled, brought to its knees, clung to by someone who has lost everything, when it's not a weapon, when it flickers, when it folds up so perfectly you can keep it until it's needed, until you can love it again, until the song in your mouth feels like sustenance, a song where the notes are sung by even the ageless woods, the short grass plains, the Red River Gorge, the fistful of land left unpoisoned, the song that's our birthright, that's sung in silence when it's too hard to go on, that sounds like someone's rough fingers weaving into another's, that sounds like a match being lit in an endless cave, the song that says, my bones are your bones, and your bones are my bones. And isn't that enough? So that I wrote that poem, and I immediately sent it to a friend, and he immediately published it. And then I thought, oh no. I'm like, no, I guess that dream will never come true. But listen, Dr. Carla Hayden at the Library of Congress loves that poem. So there you go. I'm going to move to the most recent book called The Hurting Kind. And I'll just read five poems from there. Does that sound good? And then we'll move to a Q&A. I'd like to give you sort of some idea of how your evening is going to go. It's always hard when someone comes up there. I one time went to a poetry reading where a woman had a stack of index cards like this, and she said, I'm going to read from this poem I've been working on. It's somewhat endless. And I was like, uh-oh. I was like, that's not okay. I don't want to hear an endless poem. I would like the poem to end at some point. I would like to go have a cocktail or something. It made me very nervous. So I try not to make that. Will be timely for you all. I'll read this poem because I think sometimes we can sort of praise sometimes the darker poems and the poems that are dealing with grief and all of that, which is wonderful and important, and it's work I do on a regular basis. But then sometimes I think it's also important to have good stories. And so this poem is called A Good Story. It's from my stepfather. Some days, dishes piled in the sink, books littering the coffee table are harder than others. Today, my head is packed with cockroaches, dizziness, and everywhere it hurts. Venom in the jaw, behind the eyes, between the blades. Still, the dog is snoring on my right, the cat on my left. Outside, all those red buds are just getting good. I tell a friend, the body is so bawdy, and she nods. I used to like the darkest stories, the bleak snippets someone would toss out about just how bad it could get. My stepfather told me a story about when he lived on the streets as a kid, how he'd some nights sleep under the grill at a fast food restaurant until both he and his buddy got fired. I used to like that story for some reason, something in me that believed in overcoming. But right now, all I want is a story about human kindness. The way once, when I couldn't stop crying because I was 15 and heartbroken, he came in and made me eat a small pizza he'd cut up into tiny bites until the tears stopped. Maybe I was just hungry, I said. And he nodded, holding out the last piece. I think sometimes we don't talk about our step-parents enough sometimes, and families that are expansive. So I wanted to read this poem that talks a little bit about that. I was one of the things during lockdown that was really important to me was that revisiting myths that you realize weren't necessary anymore, or maybe someone had told you that was part of, someone said, you do this in your work, or you do this in your life, or you're this, and you think, yeah, okay, that makes sense. And then, you spend a long time alone, and you're like, is that true? And this was a myth that I think that for me was something really important to revisit, which was, I always thought, when people would say, oh, after my parents got divorced, like, oh, you're from like a broken home, or you have this thing that's somehow less than. And this was my reimagining that myth, and it is the truth. Joint custody. Why did I never see it for what it was? Abundance. 2 families, 2 different kitchen tables, 2 sets of rules, 2 creeks, 2 highways, 2 step-parents with their fish tanks or 8 tracks or cigarette smoke or expertise in recipes and reading skills. I cannot reverse it. The record scratched and stopped to the original chaotic track. But let me say, I was taken back and forth on Sundays, and it was not easy, but I was loved each place. And so I have 2 brains now, 2 entirely different brains. The one that always misses where I'm not, and the one that is so relieved to finally be home. I feel like that sometimes, people tell you these things, and for some reason you hold on to them like they're true, and they're useless. Not the people, the stories. Oftentimes when I get the opportunity to read like this in front of friends and family, I like to think about the people in my family that have brought me here, the people in my life, the community. I'm very adamant that art is never made alone, that you meet friends along the way, that you make it in community, and that sometimes it also took sacrifices of people that didn't get to make art, but had an artist's soul, but maybe had to bury that a little bit in order to get you where you were supposed to be, right? And so this is a poem that I wrote for my grandfather, who is, we are all related to, Francisco Carlos Limón. He was from San Juan de los Lagos, near Jalisco, in Jalisco, in Mexico. And he definitely had an artist spirit and great singer. I remember many times him singing. But he also was a very serious person and took being a father very seriously and being an American very seriously. And I think about him a lot when I get to do readings like this. So I'm going to bring him into the room. It's also called Heart on Fire, so I wore this for him. Heart on Fire. As a foster child, my grandfather learned not to get in trouble. Mexican and motherless, dead as she was from tuberculosis, he practiced words in a new language and kept his slender head down. When the other boys begged him to slip into the music shop's upper window to steal harmonicas for each of them, music being important, thievery being secondary, he refused. When the cops came to spot the boys who'd robbed the music store, they could easily find the ones spitting broken notes into the air, joyously mouthing the stainless steel, mimicking men on street corners busking for coins. But not my grandfather. He knew not to risk it all for a stolen moment of exaltation. It's easy to imagine this is who I come from, a line of serious men who follow the rules. But might I add that later he was a dancer, a singer, an actor whose best roles ended up on the cutting room floor, a cut-up, a ham who liked a good story, who would have told you life was a series of warnings, but also magic. Once he was sent for a box of matches, and he put that box of strike anywheres in the pocket of his Madras shirt and ran home. He ran so fast to be on time, to be good, and when he did so, the whole box ignited. So he was a boy running down the canyon road with what looked like a heart on fire. He'd laugh when he'd tell you this. A heart on fire, he'd say. So you'd remember. I was just very honored last week to go to Mexico City to be part of a fandango with Dr. Biden and the First Lady of Mexico, Dr. Gutierrez Mueller. And they read poems from this book, which is pretty insane to me. But it was wonderful because my grandfather was primarily Purépecha, and they had an indigenous poet who was Purépecha read there, and it was just really moving. So 2 more poems, and I wanted to read this poem for, where is it? Oh, it's a love poem. For my husband, who's here. Against nostalgia. If I had known back then you were coming, when I first thought love could be the thing to save me after all, if I had known, would I have still glued myself to the back of his motorcycle while we flew across the starless bridge over the East River to where I grew my first garden, behind the wire fencing, in the concrete raised beds lined by ruby twilight roses? If I had known it would be you, who even then I liked to look at, across a room, always listening rigorously, a self-questioning look, the way your mouth was always your mouth. Would I have climbed back on that bike again and again until even I was sick with fumes and the sticky seat too hot in the early fall? If I had known, would I have still made mistake after mistake until I had only the trunk of me left, stripped and nearly bare of leaves? If I had known, the truth is, I would have kneeled and said, sooner, come to me sooner. And I'll close with this poem, which is a poem that I wrote very early on in the pandemic, which was people would ask me these questions like, don't you think now more than ever we need poetry? And I kept being like, or a vaccine, that would be good, or like, more medical facilities and help for our workers. And, I had trouble even believing in poetry, even though I know I believe in it. It was difficult for me to preach it then, right? And so I was feeling like it was kind of failing me on some levels because I had a very difficult time writing. And what was happening was that I was writing the poems, like I would start to think of it in my head, and then I'd be like, oh, you can't say that. You can't write about that again, or you can't do that again, or, a word I like, or whatever. And so then, of course, what happened was this list I was making in my head of the things I couldn't write about became the poem. The end of poetry. Enough of osseous and chickadee and sunflower and snowshoes, maple and seeds, samara and shoot. Enough chiaroscuro, enough of thus and prophecy and the stoic farmer and faith and our Father and 'tis of thee. Enough of bosom and bud, skin and God not forgetting and star bodies and frozen birds. Enough of the will to go on and not go on, or how a certain light does a certain thing. Enough of the kneeling and the rising and the looking inward and the looking up. Enough of the gun, the drama, the acquaintance's suicide, the long-lost letter on the dresser. Enough of the longing and the ego and the obliteration of ego. Enough of the mother and the child and the father and the child. And enough of the pointing to the world, weary and desperate. Enough of the brutal and the border. Enough of can you see me? Can you hear me? Enough I am human. Enough I am alone and I am desperate. Enough of the animal saving me. Enough of the high water. Enough sorrow. Enough of the air and its ease. I am asking you to touch me. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I'd be happy to answer questions or evade them if you have any questions for me. You want to move to the, okay. Look, we have a whole new setting over here.
I know. Yeah.
It's a whole new world over here.
Thank you so much, Ada. This is so great that on the raining evening that we have so many people coming here just to enjoy poetry. Yeah. What's the poem for tonight? What's
the poem for tonight?
For the raining night in California.
Yeah. I don't know. I'm gonna have to write it.
Okay. All right. So, do you have any questions? Okay. So we have mics in the audience, so we need to use the mic because we are recording. So okay. So there's one.
Thank you very much. Appreciate you being here, and I was just so happy to know that there's a Mexican-American poet laureate.
Oh, thank you.
And my question to you tonight is, when you wrote the poem regarding the national anthem, how soon thereafter were you named poet laureate?
Yeah. Well, I don't know if you guys remember the election of 2016. Do you remember that event? That was when that poem was written.
Oh, wow.
So that might have been, the reason for that poem's existence. Yeah.
It took them a long time to give you the poet laureate. Okay, here's one.
I was just wondering, maybe it's too soon to ask, but congratulations.
Thank you.
It's wonderful to have another poet laureate.
Yes.
And I was a little worried at one point that there wouldn't be any more. And I think Joe Biden has made sure that that's not happening. But anyway, I just wanted to ask, do you have any plans for what projects you're planning to do? And can you talk about them?
I can talk a little bit about it, yeah. And I'll say also the laureateship should be safe regardless because it was made into law by an act of Congress. It's appointed, the laureateship is appointed by the Library of Congress, by the Librarian of Congress, Dr. Carla Hayden. And so there has been a laureate. The person that is interesting is there is, in terms of an inaugural poet, that, so people that actually read at the inauguration, that historically has, for some reason, only been Democratic presidents. Yeah. But the laureateship we should be safe because, it is an act of Congress. Unless I do, screw it up somehow. I hope I don't. Just knock on wood. And I'll say I do have some big plans, and a lot of things are in the works right now. And there'll be a really fun announcement happening on January 30th about a new project that's coming. And I'll say this: the project that I'm working on, and that I'm hoping to get off the ground in the fall, is poetry and the natural world. So there's something in the works there, and I'm very excited. It will be a national poetry project. And as soon as things are more ironed down, I could tell you more, but it'll happen.
That's great.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, there's one just right behind her.
Hi. Given the nonpartisan nature of your position, how do you deal with that while writing poetry about politicized civil rights issues such as reproductive autonomy in the wake of Dobbs v. Jackson, or other issues that are important and relate to current events that you have strong opinions on but are very clearly politicized and partisan issues?
Yeah, I really appreciate that. I think the nonpartisan aspect of the role is very interesting. It's something that I don't think a lot of people are aware of, that, there's the quickest way, of course, to get the laureateship removed is to make it a partisan role, because it is an act of Congress, right? So it means that I am representing the Library of Congress. I am representing the Congress on some level. But for the most part, the role, and the only job the role has, is to widen the public's experience with poetry, right? So if I focus on that at all times, it's like, oh, that I deeply, deeply believe in it. The other thing is that even though it's a nonpartisan role, of course I'm a political person. We're all political beings. We live in this world, right? We can't not be. I can answer those questions and figure out those threads that I need to follow for myself, to heal, to work through, to rage at, by writing poems. And so I can say whatever I want in poems, with very few exceptions. Like, I really can. And so the poems are where I can, if someone were to ask me an overtly political question, I'd have to somewhat evade it, to protect the position and to ensure that it continues. Because it's a very rare thing to have this laureateship. If you go and travel the world, there's lots of places that do not have. I remember I was just in Buenos Aires, and we were talking to these incredible Argentinian poets, and they were like, we don't have a public poet that's, and she said, if we did, the office would be like somewhere in the basement, and they would just hide them, And so I think that it's something that I also really want to preserve and protect for that reason. But yeah, so if I need to work something out like that, I do it through my poems. Yeah.
Yeah, let's make politics poetic. Yeah. Okay.
Hi.
Okay, all right.
I want to say that I really appreciate you as a witness and a reporter.
Thank you.
And teaching us the names of things.
Yeah.
You know, names of plants, names, etc. I think that's one of the most valuable things poets do.
I agree.
And so thank you for that.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask about that process of being a witness and being a reporter, because there's such a temptation to be fictive. And whether or not there's a deeper truth in the fictive, or whether or not you think it's really important that you know, like a folk singer, tell it like it is as you see it.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate that question. I feel for me, one of the things that's always amazed me about writing poetry is that the truth is so weird, right? Like the more, like you start to learn about nature, and then you start to, something unravels and you think, wait, what? That bird does what? You know? Or this water gets from where to where? How does that happen? And I think that there's so many times where we think, not just even in the natural world, but like, you know, I think it's weird. I mean, we're animals that wear clothes. That's weird. There's no other animals that wear clothes. Like there's a very strange, like the strangeness of the world is in its truths. And I don't need to go searching very far to find that sort of awe and wonder and strangeness and surreality within the reality. And I think that's part, like what keeps me sort of interested, engaged, and curious about our life, even when it's hard, is that there are so many little small places for wonder and strangeness to take place. So yeah, I think the truth is actually really one of the best places to find that just amazement. Yeah.
Great. So we have a, over there? Yeah, okay. Okay, so.
Hi, great poetry. Thank you for sharing it.
Thank you.
I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your writing process.
Yeah, thank you. My writing process varies a little bit, and it's changed over the years. I'd sort of be lying if I just like, oh, I had to do this one thing every day. And I'll say that for me, I write in a journal every day, and I write an intention for the day, and then I actually include things that I have to do. And then there are often poems and things that have happened to me, and those are written. Sometimes it feels more like a journal, and sometimes it's very lineated, and I write in lines when I write poems. And then when I have a little more time, I'll sit down and sort of go through that and see if there's anything there that excites me, and I'll start to then transfer that to, I almost said the typewriter, to the laptop. I don't know where that came from, to my typewriter, and start to revise it from there, and then so that it's already gone through like one little big transition. I like to write longhand. One is because it's very easy for me to forget about drafts in Word files, and I never return to them. But if I have an actual journal that I can flip through, I find things easier. I also think I remember things better if I write it longhand versus typing it. So that's part of my process. When I have a longer time, sometimes I'll sit down and I could maybe even revise and work on 3 or 4 poems at once. Then there are other days where a poem comes to me like almost complete, and I sit down and I won't even write it longhand. I'll write it right on the computer. And it's like, I know where it's, you know, so, or at least I know where to pull at to figure out where it might go. So, you know, it's a little more mercurial than it used to be, but because I'm travel so much, but I trust it now, I think. I used to have moments where I thought I'd finish a poem and think, well, I guess I'll never write again. And now I think, yeah, maybe I won't write for a little while, but then I will. And I trust that a lot. And that's something I think for younger writers, I'm always like, you know, remember that it'll come. It'll come if you call it, if you listen. I think I'll just add this, and then I'll stop talking. Long answer to question. Well, is that silence is really important for me. And I think we're not silent very often in our lives. And so I need, part of writing longhand is also being away from the screen, because there's that visual noise too. And just being really alone with silence and hearing the world. Yeah.
Yeah, that was gonna be my question. Do you actually read it aloud when you write, or do you just hear it here?
It's both. I
It's
hear it
both.
here, and then I start to compose out loud so that I can hear the music of the poem.
And then also, do you dance when you write?
Sometimes. Sometimes,
Yes.
depending on the poem, you can see the
Yeah.
different poems. Like there's the more public poems, like a new national anthem. It has a rhythm that continues, and so when I'm reading it, I'm like, oh yeah, there is a rhythm to it that I kind of follow with my body.
Yeah, because earlier, I mean, you probably don't know that she actually had a drama degree, right? Theater
Yeah.
degree as undergrad. So that's why
Yeah.
earlier we were talking about embodiment,
Yeah.
right? How you embody the language.
Yeah, and the body as an instrument, not just sort of the mind, which I think a lot of people are just like, oh, poems are just in the mind, but they aren't. They're in our whole being.
Great. And we have one.
He had the same question.
Oh, the same question. Okay. All right. Here. Yeah. Over there.
Hi, I just want to say thank you once again. As a person who may be bilingual, do you ever find yourself writing poems in Spanish or incorporating Spanish words? And do you have any projects that may be bilingual in the future?
Yeah, I love that question. I'm actually not bilingual. My older brother is, and he puts me to shame. Even my nephew is. But I'm working on it. I can understand a lot of Spanish, and I am one of those that terrible person that people speak Spanish to me, and then I just answer in English because I understand it, but then I'm too ashamed of my terrible Spanish to, so I'm working on that. But I will say that Bright Dead Things is in translation, and that's coming out shortly, which I'm very excited about. And then I think both The Hurting Kind and The Caring are going to be translated by Valparaíso Press into Spanish. So those projects are very exciting to me. Yeah, and then I have a little, it's a collection of very short essays, linked essays. It's sort of one essay that's all about trees. And it's called Shelter, and it's on Scribd. I don't know if you know it, but it's audio, and they just translated that. It's out today in Spanish. Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
All right. There's one, and here's one.
There's a lot of young writers here, a lot of people who are just beginning to think of maybe having a vocation as a writer. What advice would you give to someone who's considering a life of writing?
Yeah, that's a beautiful question. Thank you, friend. I think for me, there's a couple things to keep in mind when you're actually thinking like, oh, this could be what I do, is that it is like any art in which that, unless you're somehow independently wealthy, which is a beautiful thing, and more power to you if you are, wonderful. I am not, and was not. And so for me, I always had to find a way to make a living. And I think the big part of me was always trying to marry what it was to have a life and full life as an artist, and then also make a living and not resent the life I had as the person who was making a living, and to sort of find some wholeness in there. So for me, after I got my degree at NYU, which I just paid off my student loans like yesterday, well, like a couple of months ago, but yes. I took out a lot of loans to go to NYU. It was not something that was, easy. And then I got a job I worked for magazines. I worked for Travel and Leisure magazine. I worked for Martha Stewart. I worked for GQ for a long time. I was the copy director there. I used my writing skill in order to get jobs that, that were able to inspire me somewhat, right? I liked working in magazines. There was a culture there. There was some excitement there. And it wasn't until I had published my third book of poems that I was like, okay, maybe I'll see if I can be a full-time writer. And even then, what happened was I spent most of the day freelancing for those magazines back in New York. So So that's how I made my living for a very long time. And I think it's important to find ways that you can support yourself and also not feel any shame in that. Because I think a lot of people feel like, well, if I'm not doing this full time, am I a writer? Like, yeah. Are you writing? Yes. I mean, you get up at 5 a.m, you write before work, or you come home, and I would often just come home, and I would clear my desk and I would just write, and it felt so good to do that. And I think that there's just a lot of us that have always had to live in that dual life of being an artist and also having to live in a world that requires money, and not to have any shame in doing many different things to make that happen. Yeah. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for coming here to speak.
I could not see you for the
Yep, right under your nose. Yeah, thank you so much for coming here to speak with us. As a fellow writer, I'm always so curious about this question with other writers, but I was wondering if there are any poets or writers that you look to, maybe their voice or style or just the way they see the world influences you. I was wondering if you could tell us if there's any writers like that who really influence your writing, even subconsciously, that you really admire.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. It changes a lot for me, and there's sort of moments where I get involved, and I'm like, this is who I'm only going to read this person from you. It's like, I'm only going to read Lorca. I'm only going to do this, but it shifts and changes. But I do think there's a few sort of core ones that I have always returned to. One is Audre Lorde. I think her poetry is exceptional. The other is Elizabeth Bishop. And her sort of visual element, the way that she really deeply looked at the world. Lucille Clifton, I just always admired. And there's a few poets that are not, like Alejandra Pizarnik, who is an incredible poet from Buenos Aires. And I find her work just amazing. And there's a new collected that's in translation now, which is called Extracting the Stones of Madness. And Yvette Siegert is the translator, and it's fantastic. So I'm always also looking sort of outside of, the United States also to get some influence. And Pizarnik is one of my favorites. Also Gabriela Mistral from Chile. Yeah, sure.
Okay, yeah, please.
Yes, thank you so much for sharing your wonderful work with us. I had a question which we all probably have at some time, which is, what was the first event in your life that actually made you want to sit down and write about? Do you remember?
That's a great question. I feel like I'll say this, is that every time, I feel like when people ask me like how I became a poet, I could probably each day answer with a different story. Does that make sense? Like, because it's almost like, how did you become you? Like, you're like, well, there was a series of events yesterday, so each thing has pushed me in this way. And I'll say that I do remember very earnestly listening to poetry on the Power of the Word program on PBS with Bill Moyers. And it was Lucille Clifton, Phil Levine, Sharon Olds, and they were reading their poems. And I remember I was, I think, 8 or 10, and I went into my room at this little desk, and I thought, I'm going to write this poem. And I wrote this poem, and it was so terrible that I was confused because they made it look so easy. And I thought, well, Lucille Clifton, it seemed very simple, it seemed very effortless. And then I went back and I just kept looking at it, and then I would look at the tape, and I was like, this must be much harder than I think it is. But I do remember that kind of trying to mimic that very early on, and feeling like I was a very long way away from that experience. But I also always wrote songs, hum songs, lyrics, all that kind of stuff throughout my life. So that was a big part of me translating the world. Yeah, is the music of it. Thank you so much.
Okay. Okay, you okay. Okay.
Hi. Thank you so much for your work. I have a question about your writing. So I think, I guess just personally, I know when you're younger, like at least for me, I've been a lot bolder about sharing work, etc. But as I get older, I find myself being more reticent about sharing personal things and things like that. So I know that you have 6 different collections, all really great. I'm wondering, if you ever look back on certain poems and you feel like they are not, or you feel like you've changed your mind about how you feel certain things or things like that. I kind of am curious about your perspective on having that work out there and having it being published and people associating that with you. Like, I guess, what's your perspective on that?
That's a great question. I love that question. And I think one of the things that's, I have, very early on, my first book came out and I was on a radio show in Pittsburgh. It was the first time I'd ever been on the radio. And the host there had said, well, we just had Mark Doty in, and he was saying that he was very embarrassed about his first books. And here I was with my first book. And I thought, well, and I remember thinking, I don't want to feel that way. I don't want to feel that way. And, Mark might have been saying that about a chapbook or something, I'm sure, but Mark's never written a bad poem in his life, so I don't know. But I remember very earnestly being like, I don't want that feeling. And so I made the decision early on that whatever happened, I was going to look back and say, she did the best she could with what she had. And I do that now. I really do. Like if I think, I would edit that or I would change that or that word sticks out to me or something like that, I leave it. And I'm really like, that's what she had. That's what the tools I had at that time. And I'll just say this funny anecdote, which is that, we live in Kentucky and people have made me these lovely broadsides of my own work with, art, and so we have 2 poems in the house. We have a few more than that, but we have 2 poems that are hanging in the house that are 2 different men. So my husband has to look at these poems that are to men that I dated prior to him. So we laugh at it all the time, and it's just funny to it. This is life. This is, and so I think there's a part of me that has learned to not just sort of, not just find some tenderness, but also, find some joy in who I was even just yesterday, which is different than who I am today. And you're always going to feel that.
I really want to ask this question myself. And I think probably a lot of people have this question too, that, okay, so let's say this is the first time I experience heartbreak, or I saw Orion, or I see the first flower I see in the spring, and I want to write a poem. How do I start?
Yeah. I think for me, it always begins with questions. So if I were to see a flower and think, I really want to write a poem about that flower, the first question I would ask would say, well, why do I like that flower? What is it that is particular about that flower? Why not that weed? Isn't that weed just as important as this flower? What about this flower reminds me about other flowers? Or does it not remind me about flowers? Everything for me begins with questions and the self-interrogation of that. And you can, that's our life, right? Like exploration and like everything is questions. And I think the best part about being a poet is that you start with questions and you end with more questions. And it means that you will always write poems because there's always more questions.
Nice. Do we have time?
6:40, so.
Okay, all right. Okay, maybe one last question. Okay, your hand is right, yeah, very high, so okay.
Thank you. I had a question just came to mind that kind of complements the one that you asked, so I'm really glad you asked that. First of all, thank you so much for reading. It was really wonderful to hear you read your work. How do you know when something you're working on is finished?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I compose out loud when especially if I'm getting to the end state of the poem. I just wrote a poem recently that probably was 16 drafts. And every time, I read it out loud, and then if you hear something that's off, they're dissonant, you come back to it and be like, oh, either it needs more dissonance somewhere else, or it needs to be smoothed out, or it needs to be distressed a little bit more. So I'm always listening to the sounds, and then how the line breaks work to move the poem forward, to propel forward. The line breaks for me should be sort of like effortlessly walking down the stairs. But then it should also contain that breath and mystery at the same time. And sometimes line breaks need to be a little jarring, but a lot of times I'm looking for something that feels more natural, like breath. And so for me, it's like, oh, when it's complete is when the music is complete in each reading of it, and nothing sort of sticks out as something that either is maybe trying too hard, right? There are times I get caught up in sounds, and so sometimes I just want to put like every sound I've ever heard into this poem, and then I'm like, oh right, that is overkill. So that's really listening to what the poem is also trying to do. Now that's the sound work. The other thing is that I'm making sure that the poem's intention is somehow working throughout the poem, not just my intention for the poem. Because oftentimes I'm reading a draft and think, oh, I started writing this poem thinking it would end here, but actually this poem is teaching me that the ending is here, and I'm in conflict with that. And the worst thing that we can do is not make a choice about that conflict, right? And that's when people are like, I can't figure out this ending, and then you say, well, what's important to you? And they say, well, I want it to be mysterious. It could end either way. And you're like, no, it can't. Because for you, something is more important. And oftentimes it's what the poem is teaching you, which is there's something, oh, this is the thing that I'm supposed to take away from this, not the thing that I thought brought me to the page. Yeah, so those are the two things I look for. Yeah.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.